Laura Carter had always been proud of her work. At 38, she was a successful architect who had spent years designing structures that combined modern aesthetics with practicality. After a messy divorce and years of putting her career before herself, Laura finally decided it was time to build something just for her, a home that reflected her independence, strength, and vision. She had chosen a quiet suburb for her new beginning, away from the chaos of the city. Her house, sitting at the edge of a cul-de-sac, was her dream made real. Every line, every angle of the house was her own creation. The property was framed by a sleek yet sturdy fence, its minimalist design complementing the rest of the house. Laura had also installed automatic gates with smart security systems, ensuring her privacy while maintaining the elegance she valued. The front yard, though small, was carefully landscaped with lavender, boxwood shrubs, and a neatly maintained lawn. It wasn't ostentatious, but it stood out in the neighborhood filled with cookie-cutter homes and aging picket fences. Laura's neighbors had been mostly welcoming, stopping by during her first week to introduce themselves. A few even complimented her home, though there were polite hints that her modern design didn't exactly fit in with the neighborhood. She brushed it off. Her property conformed to all zoning laws and architectural guidelines, so she had nothing to worry about. Then came Karen. Karen lived 3 houses down, a widow in her late 60s with a perfectly manicured front yard and an air of self-appointed authority. Laura met her on her second day, when Karen appeared uninvited at her front door. She wore a pastel cardigan and carried a clipboard, which she immediately brandished like a weapon. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Karen said with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Karen Thompson, the head of our HOA. We like to keep things running smoothly here, so I thought I'd stop by and explain a few things about the community." Laura smiled politely, though she already disliked the tone Karen used. She had dealt with plenty of controlling personalities in her line of work and recognized one immediately. Karen's friendly demeanor was a facade. Her real goal was to assert dominance. "Thank you," Laura said. "I've read through the HOA regulations already, so I think I'm all set." Karen's smile tightened further. "Well, I noticed your fence," she began, glancing toward the sleek metal design that enclosed Laura's property. "It's quite striking, but it does stand out a bit, don't you think? Most of the homes on this street follow a more traditional aesthetic. You might want to consider something that aligns better with the rest of the neighborhood." Laura took a calming breath. "My fence meets all the HOA guidelines. It's within the height limit, and the design was approved by the county's zoning office before installation." Karen raised an eyebrow. I'll have to double-check that. Sometimes these contractors don't follow the rules as closely as they should." "That won't be necessary," Laura said, her voice firm but polite. "I made sure everything was in compliance before I started building." Karen didn't reply immediately. Instead, she gave Laura another tight smile and changed the subject to upcoming HOA meetings, subtly implying that attendance was expected. Laura nodded along, all the while growing increasingly irritated by Karen's condescension. When Karen finally left, Laura exhaled deeply and shook her head. She had dealt with plenty of people like Karen in her career, and she knew better than to let them get under her skin. But something about Karen's tone, the quiet threat behind her words, left Laura uneasy. Over the next few days, Laura settled into her new home, ignoring the nagging sense of discomfort Karen had left behind. She focused on work, unpacking, and enjoying the quiet of the suburb. However, her peace was short-lived. Karen began showing up unannounced, finding excuses to knock on Laura's door. One day it was to talk about HOA, approved garbage bin placement, another time to warn Laura about keeping her hedges trimmed to regulation height. Laura remained polite but firm during these interactions, unwilling to let Karen push her around. But her patience began to wear thin when Karen started bringing up the fence at every opportunity. "It really does create such a harsh look," Karen said one afternoon, standing on the sidewalk while Laura watered her plants. "Don't you think a white picket fence would be so much more inviting?" Laura set down the watering can. "Karen, I appreciate your concern, but my fence is staying. It was designed to match the house, and it's not violating any rules." Karen's expression hardened. "We'll see about that," she muttered before walking away. That night, Laura reviewed the HOA guidelines again, just to be sure. Everything was in order. She had all the necessary permits, and her fence conformed to every rule. Still, Karen's persistence bothered her. It wasn't just about the fence. Karen seemed intent on asserting control over Laura's home and her choices. A week later, Laura came home from work to find an envelope taped to her front door. It was from the HOA, and inside was a formal letter demanding that she attend a hearing to discuss violations of neighborhood aesthetic standards. The letter specifically mentioned her fence and warned that non-compliance could result in fines or mandatory changes to her property. Laura stared at the letter, her frustration building. She knew this was Karen's doing. It was ridiculous. She had followed every rule, yet Karen was determined to make her life difficult. For the first time, Laura began to wonder if her new neighborhood was the fresh start she had hoped for, or if it was about to become a battleground. Laura woke up to the sound of metal clattering, loud enough to jolt her out of a deep sleep. She sat up in bed, heart pounding, and strained to listen. At first she thought it might be an animal in the yard, but the noise came again, sharp and deliberate, followed by what sounded like an engine revving. She jumped out of bed, grabbed her phone, and hurried to the front window. Pulling back the curtain, she froze. Her front yard was a disaster. One side of her sleek, modern fence was completely smashed, jagged metal pieces scattered across her carefully landscaped lawn. Sitting squarely in the middle of the wreckage was a massive black SUV. Its headlights were still on, illuminating the destruction. And standing next to it, inspecting the damage with infuriating nonchalance, was Karen. Laura stormed outside, her breath visible in the cool morning air. "Karen," she called, voice sharp with anger. "What the hell happened here?" Karen turned, unfazed, and offered a shrug. "Oh, good morning, Laura. I was just backing out of my driveway, and well, your fence got in the way. It's such an awkward design, don't you think? So close to the curb." "Got in the way?" Laura echoed, incredulous. "This fence is on my property. You had no reason to be anywhere near it, let alone drive through it." Karen smiled thinly, as if Laura were overreacting. "It's not entirely your property, actually. My late husband always said that this side of the lawn was part of our original plot, but the surveyors must have made a mistake years ago. I've been meaning to bring it up at the HOA meeting, but I suppose this is as good a time as any to address it." Laura stared at her, dumbfounded. "That's ridiculous. The property line is clearly marked, and I have all the paperwork to prove it. You've destroyed my fence and half my yard. This has nothing to do with property lines." Karen waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Laura. It's just a fence. Besides, I've already called the HOA to let them know about the situation. We'll sort it out together, like good neighbors. There's no need to get hostile." "Hostile?" Laura felt a surge of frustration so strong she had to clench her fists to keep from shouting. "You drove through my fence, parked on my lawn, and now you're telling me it's my fault because of some imaginary property dispute. You're paying for the damage, Karen. Every penny." Karen's smile didn't waver, but her tone grew colder. "I think you'll find that these things aren't as black and white as you believe. We'll see what the HOA has to say about your little fence. Until then, I suggest you calm down. It's unbecoming." With that, Karen turned back to her SUV, climbed in, and reversed off Laura's lawn, as if she hadn't just demolished half the front yard. She didn't so much as glance back as she drove away, leaving Laura standing in the wreckage, seething. As the adrenaline began to wear off, Laura grabbed her phone and took photos of the damage. The fence was beyond repair, twisted and bent where Karen's SUV had plowed through it. The once pristine lawn was littered with tire tracks and chunks of broken metal. Her lavender bushes were flattened, and one of the automated gate posts was leaning at an awkward angle. Laura called the police to report the incident. An officer arrived about 20 minutes later, his patrol car pulling up next to the mangled fence. He stepped out, clipboard in hand, and surveyed the scene with a low whistle. "Looks like someone didn't know how to use reverse," he remarked, scribbling notes. Laura explained everything: how Karen had driven through her fence, claimed part of the lawn as her own, and then brushed it off like it was nothing. The officer nodded along, taking notes, but when Laura asked about pressing charges, his response made her stomach drop. "Well, ma'am, since it's on private property and no one was injured, this is technically a civil matter." You'll need to file a claim with your insurance company, and if necessary, take it up with the HOA or small claims court. Are you serious? Laura asked, incredulous. She destroyed my property. Isn't that vandalism? The officer gave her a sympathetic look. It's a gray area. If you want to pursue it, you'll need to document everything thoroughly. Photos, receipts for the repairs, any communication with her or the HOA, it'll all help if it goes to court. Frustrated but determined, Laura thanked the officer and saw him off. As soon as he left, she started gathering every piece of evidence she could. She photographed the damage from multiple angles, saved the police report number, and began compiling the documentation for her property line survey, permits and HOA guidelines. The next morning, she received an official letter from the HOA, summoning her to a hearing about her unauthorized fence installation and possible encroachment on neighboring property. Laura stared at the letter in disbelief. It was clear Karen had wasted no time spinning the narrative in her favor. Determined not to let Karen win, Laura called the surveying company that had handled her property's original boundaries and requested updated documentation. She also contacted her insurance company to report the incident and began researching local property laws. But Karen wasn't done. That evening, as Laura returned from a meeting with her insurance adjuster, she noticed something new on her lawn, a small wooden sign hammered into the ground where the fence had been. It read, "Under HOA review, no unauthorized construction." Laura ripped the sign out of the ground and marched straight to Karen's house, her patience officially gone. She banged on the door, and Karen answered with her usual air of smugness. "Can I help you?" Karen asked, feigning innocence. "Stay off my property," Laura snapped, holding up the sign. "This is harassment, Karen, and I'm not going to tolerate it." Karen crossed her arms, unfazed. "I'm just doing my duty as HOA president. If you can't handle the rules of the community, maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for you." Laura took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "You've caused thousands of dollars in damage to my property and are now trying to pin this on me. I have documentation, Karen property surveys, permits, even video evidence of your SUV on my lawn. This won't end the way you think it will." For the first time, Karen's mask slipped just slightly. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Do what you need to do, Laura," she said coolly. "But you might find that finding the HOA is more trouble than it's worth." Laura didn't bother responding. She turned and walked away, gripping the wooden sign so tightly her knuckles turned white. As she reached her house, she glanced at the mangled remains of her fence and felt a renewed sense of resolve. If Karen wanted a war, Laura would give her one. But this time, it would be fought on Laura's terms, and she didn't plan on losing. The HOA hearing was scheduled for the following week, but Laura knew she couldn't wait that long to take action. Karen's smugness and her audacity to park the blame for the destruction of the fence squarely on Laura had pushed her past the point of patience. Over the next few days, Laura buried herself in preparation. She contacted the property surveyor again, ensuring she had an updated report of her land's boundaries. She dug through every HOA document she could find, combing through the rules to arm herself with the ammunition she needed. If Karen wanted to weaponize bureaucracy, Laura would be ready to fire back. But Karen wasn't sitting idle. Every morning, Laura found new reminders of Karen's growing hostility. On Monday, she woke to find Karen's black SUV parked halfway onto her lawn, its tires leaving deep ruts in the sod. When Laura knocked on her door to confront her, Karen simply smiled and said, "Oh, it's only temporary. The street gets so crowded these days, don't you think?" By Wednesday, Laura discovered that one of her sprinklers had been mysteriously smashed, its pieces scattered across the yard. Then came the trash incident. Returning from the grocery store one afternoon, Laura found her recycling bin overturned, its contents strewn across her driveway. She was sure it wasn't the work of animals. There was a deliberate, calculated messiness to it. Karen, of course, was nowhere to be seen during these moments. But every time Laura glanced toward her neighbor's house, she could feel eyes watching her through the window. It wasn't paranoia. Karen wanted her to know she was being targeted. Determined to document everything, Laura began keeping a detailed record. She took photos of the SUV on her lawn, the damaged sprinkler, the trash. She also called her insurance company to confirm the cost of repairing the fence, which had skyrocketed after she learned the gate's motor had been irreparably damaged in the collision. The estimate was well into the thousands. The real blow came when Laura received an email from the HOA. It wasn't about the upcoming hearing. Instead, it was a formal notice informing her that she had been assessed a fine for violations of neighborhood upkeep standards. The fine? $2,500. The violations? Unsightly property damage, improperly maintained landscaping, and hazardous materials left on the lawn. Laura stared at the email, her jaw tightening. She knew exactly what had happened. Karen had somehow twisted the narrative to make Laura's damaged fence and yard appear as though they were her fault. The hazardous materials were likely referring to the mangled remains of the fence itself. Fuming, Laura printed out the email and added it to her growing pile of evidence. She called the HOA office immediately, demanding an explanation. But the woman on the phone simply referred her to the upcoming hearing. "That's where these matters are addressed," the woman said in a bored tone, as though Laura were just another nuisance. Laura didn't back down. "I'm not waiting for the hearing to correct false accusations," she said firmly. "I have photographic evidence that the damage to my property was caused by another resident, Karen Thompson, to be specific." The woman hesitated for a moment before replying. "Well, Ms. Carter, the hearing is also a chance for you to provide evidence in your defense. I suggest you prepare your case thoroughly." The passive-aggressive dismissal in the woman's voice made Laura want to scream, but she hung up and focused on what she could control. The next morning, she took things a step further. She hired a contractor to inspect the damage to her fence and prepare a detailed report, which she could submit as part of her defense at the hearing. The contractor, a burly man named Greg, shook his head as he walked the property. "This isn't just a simple collision," he said, pointing to the crumpled gate. "Whoever hit this thing didn't stop at the first impact. Look here, you can see where the vehicle pushed forward again. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate." The words sent a chill through Laura. She had suspected Karen's actions were more than carelessness, but hearing it confirmed by someone else gave her a deeper sense of unease. "Make sure you put that in the report," Laura said, her voice steady. "I'll need every detail for the hearing." Greg nodded. "Will do. And you might want to think about some extra security measures. Cameras, maybe." Laura had already thought of that. The following day, she had a professional security system installed. Cameras now covered every angle of her property, from the front yard to the back. The system was linked to her phone, allowing her to monitor the footage in real time. She didn't care if Karen noticed the cameras. In fact, she hoped she did. But Karen wasn't the type to back down just because she'd been caught on camera. That weekend, as Laura reviewed her evidence and prepared for the hearing, she heard the unmistakable rumble of Karen's sub again. She rushed to the window, phone in hand, just in time to see the vehicle inching onto her lawn. Laura burst out the door, camera rolling, but Karen was already stepping out of the car, holding a stack of papers. "Good afternoon, Laura," Karen said with that familiar condescending smile. "I thought I'd drop off some additional information for the hearing. You know, just to keep things transparent." Laura stared at her, incredulous. "Transparent? You mean like how you transparently drove through my fence and then blamed me for it?" Karen's smile didn't falter. "Well, we all have our perspectives, don't we? Anyway, I think you'll find these documents enlightening. They outline some of the historical property lines for this neighborhood. It's fascinating, really." Laura snatched the papers from Karen's hands, glancing at them briefly. They were a mix of old surveys and handwritten notes, none of which looked remotely official. "This is nonsense," Laura said, holding the papers up. "And you know it. My property lines are legally documented and up to date. You're grasping at straws, Karen." Karen tilted her head, her smile hardening into something colder. "We'll see what the HOA has to say, won't we? It's always best to let the proper authorities decide these matters." Laura stepped closer, her voice low and steady. "Stay off my lawn. Stay away from my property. And stop trying to intimidate me, Karen. It won't work." Karen's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. She climbed back into her sub and drove off, the tires kicking up dirt as she left. As Laura watched her go, A sense of resolve settled over her. The hearing was days away, but she was ready. Karen wanted to play games, but Laura wasn't the type to lose not when it came to defending what was hers. The day of the HOA hearing arrived, and Laura came prepared for battle. She walked into the sterile conference room at the HOA office with a thick binder in hand, containing every piece of evidence she had meticulously gathered: photographs of the damaged fence and lawn, video stills of Karen's SUV parked on her property, the contractor's detailed report, property surveys proving her legal boundary lines, and a timeline of Karen's escalating behavior. Her lawyer, a sharp woman named Stephanie Reed, accompanied her, adding a layer of professional confidence that Laura desperately needed. Karen was already there, seated at the head of the long table as though she were presiding over the meeting. She wore her usual pastel cardigan and a smug expression, flanked by two other HOA board members, who looked as though they had been personally vetted to support her. A few other neighbors sat along the sides of the room, most likely there out of curiosity. Laura caught the eye of Tom, the one neighbor who had quietly offered her support, and he gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. The meeting began with Karen clearing her throat and addressing the room with a voice dripping in authority. "Thank you all for coming today. As you know, we're here to discuss a series of violations and disputes involving Ms. Laura Carter. These issues include property encroachment, non-compliance with neighborhood aesthetic standards, and damage to communal property." Laura's eyebrows shot up at the mention of communal property. Karen continued, unfazed, as if she hadn't just lied through her teeth. "It is our responsibility as a community to ensure that every resident adheres to the guidelines we've all agreed upon. This is what maintains the character and harmony of our neighborhood," Karen said, folding her hands neatly on the table as though she were delivering a sermon. Stephanie leaned over and whispered, "Let her dig her hole. We'll handle it." When it was Laura's turn to speak, she stood and addressed the room, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling under the surface. "I'd like to correct several misstatements made here today. First and foremost, my property is fully compliant with all HOA regulations, as outlined in the documents I've provided. The fence was professionally installed, and the design was approved by zoning officials before construction. Secondly, I'd like to address the claim of property encroachment, which is entirely baseless." Laura opened her binder and passed copies of her property survey to the board members, including Karen, who barely glanced at it. "As you can see," Laura continued, "the survey confirms that the fence is well within my property lines. The allegations to the contrary are nothing more than unfounded speculation." Karen interrupted, her tone sharp. "Speculation? The original property lines for this neighborhood were documented decades ago. Just because you have a newer survey doesn't mean it overrides the historical layout of this area." Stephanie stepped in, her calm demeanor slicing through Karen's bluster. "Actually, it does. Under state law, legally recorded property surveys take precedence over any informal or outdated maps. Unless you have an updated survey of your own, Ms. Thompson, your claims hold no legal weight." Karen's lips thinned, but she recovered quickly. "Well, even if the property lines are technically correct, there's still the issue of neighborhood aesthetics. Ms. Carter's fence is an eyesore, and several residents have complained about how it disrupts the harmony of the street." Laura fought the urge to roll her eyes. "If there are complaints, I'd like to see them." Karen smirked and produced a stack of papers from her bag. "Gladly. These are statements from your neighbors expressing their concerns about your fence." Laura scanned the documents as Stephanie flipped through them beside her. Most were generic complaints about the fence being too modern or out of place. Laura recognized a few names and suspected Karen had pressured them into writing these letters. Stephanie pulled out one in particular and held it up. "This letter," Stephanie said, "is unsigned. Do we have any confirmation that it actually came from a resident?" Karen waved her hand dismissively. "Not everyone feels comfortable putting their name on complaints. That doesn't make them any less valid." "It does in a legal context," Stephanie replied smoothly. "Anonymous complaints are not considered credible evidence, especially in disputes involving property rights." Karen's composure cracked slightly, but she quickly shifted gears. "Regardless, the damage to Ms. Carter's property was caused by you," Laura cut in, unable to stay silent any longer. The room fell silent, all eyes on Laura as she stood and flipped to a specific section in her binder. Here is photographic evidence of Ms. Thompson's SUV parked on my lawn multiple times. Here is the police report documenting her collision with my fence. And here, she said, pulling out a still frame from her security footage, is video evidence of her vehicle causing further damage to my property. She handed the documents to the board members, one of whom visibly paled as he glanced at the footage. Karen's face remained frozen, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. Stephanie took over, her voice calm but firm. This evidence not only exonerates my client, but also implicates Ms. Thompson in a pattern of harassment and property damage. Furthermore, the fine imposed on Ms. Carter for so-called unsightly property damage is clearly a retaliatory action orchestrated by Ms. Thompson to deflect blame. We demand that the fine be revoked immediately and that the HOA investigate Ms. Thompson's misuse of her authority as president. The room buzzed with murmurs as the board members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a man in his 50s who looked particularly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "This is a serious matter. I think we need to review all the evidence before making any decisions." Karen attempted to regain control. "There's no need for a full review. This is just a misunderstanding." "No," Laura interrupted, her voice firm. "This is a pattern of bullying, and it's gone on long enough. I've complied with every rule, followed every guideline, and yet I'm the one being fined and dragged through these ridiculous accusations. It's time for this to stop." The board members seemed to shrink under Laura's glare. Tom, sitting quietly in the back, finally spoke up. "I've lived here for 10 years, and I've seen this happen before. Karen's used her position in the HOA to go after anyone who doesn't do things her way. It's about time someone stood up to her." Karen shot him a venomous look, but the damage was done. The room was turning against her, and she knew it. After a tense pause, one of the board members finally spoke. "We'll need to adjourn this meeting and review the evidence before making a decision. Until then, all fines against Miss Carter are suspended." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the board member cut her off. "That's final." Laura exhaled, the tension in her chest easing slightly. It wasn't over, but it was a step in the right direction. Karen's composure was gone, her face flushed with anger as she gathered her things and stormed out of the room. As Laura left the meeting, Stephanie turned to her with a rare smile. "You handled yourself well in there." Laura nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. Karen might have started this fight, but Laura was determined to finish it, and this time, she had the upper hand. The victory at the HOA hearing was short-lived. While the board had temporarily suspended the fines and promised to review the evidence, Karen was clearly not about to let the matter rest. Over the next few days, Laura could feel the pressure around her intensifying, as though Karen had shifted her tactics from direct confrontation to a more insidious form of warfare. It started subtly. Laura's mailbox was suddenly stuffed with HOA notices almost every day, far more than usual. They were petty complaints about her property, excessive weeds in her garden, which didn't exist, unapproved lighting fixtures on her porch, and even a bizarre claim that her trash bins were placed at an unsafe angle on collection days. Each notice demanded action, and each came with thinly veiled threats of additional fines. At first, Laura ignored them. She knew Karen was behind it, trying to bury her in paperwork and harass her into submission. But then, one morning, she found a bright orange tag taped to her front door, declaring that her home was under review for unapproved structural modifications. The notice stated that an inspection would be conducted in the coming week, and any violations found could result in further penalties. Laura's frustration boiled over. The so-called unapproved structural modifications were non-existent. Her home was built according to the strictest codes and regulations, and every element had been approved well before construction. But she knew this wasn't about rules or regulations. This was Karen leveraging her position in the HOA to make Laura's life as difficult as possible. Laura's lawyer, Stephanie, advised her to stay calm and continue documenting everything. "This kind of harassment can work against her if we escalate the case," Stephanie said. "The more baseless accusations she throws your way, the more ammunition we'll have to prove her misuse of power." But Karen wasn't done. Late one night, as Laura sat reviewing her paperwork in the living room, she noticed headlights outside her window. She peeked through the curtains and saw Karen's SUV idling across the street. Karen wasn't alone. Another car, a smaller sedan, was parked behind hers. Two figures stood in Laura's driveway, their shadows stretching across the lawn under the dim glow of the streetlights. Laura's heart raced. She grabbed her phone and quietly opened the security app connected to her cameras. Switching to the live feed, she zoomed in on the figures. One of them was Karen, holding a flashlight and pointing at different parts of Laura's property. The other figure, a man in a dark jacket, was scribbling notes on a clipboard. "What the hell are they doing?" Laura muttered, hitting the record button on the app. Karen and the man spent the next 15 minutes walking the perimeter of Laura's property, shining the flashlight at her fence, her landscaping, and even her windows. They spoke in hushed tones, but the cameras caught snippets of their conversation. "Clear violation," the man said at one point, gesturing toward the fence. Karen responded with a laugh. "I told you she thinks she's above the rules. We'll put an end to that." Laura's hands shook with anger as she watched them. It was clear that Karen had enlisted this man, likely some kind of HOA inspector or associate, to fabricate more violations. Laura debated confronting them, but Stephanie's voice echoed in her mind, "Document everything." So she stayed inside, recording until they finally left. The next morning, Laura awoke to find another notice taped to her door. This one accused her of unauthorized alterations to the property boundary and stated that the HOA would be conducting a formal review of her home within 48 hours. It also included a new fine $3,000 for repeated violations. That was the last straw. Laura called Stephanie, her voice trembling with anger. "She's crossed the line. She was on my property last night with some guy, fabricating violations. I have it all on camera. What do we do now?" Stephanie's tone was calm but firm. "We escalate. I'm filing an injunction to stop the HOA from issuing any further fines until this matter is resolved, and we'll be sending a cease and desist letter to Karen, warning her that her actions constitute harassment and trespassing." Stephanie also suggested bringing the police into the situation. "They may not have done much before, but with the video evidence of Karen on your property, they'll have to take it seriously. At the very least, it'll send a message." Laura agreed and sent the footage to both Stephanie and the local police department. By the end of the day, Stephanie had filed the necessary paperwork, and Laura felt a small sense of relief knowing that she was finally fighting back. But Karen wasn't done. The following evening, Laura returned home to find her lawn completely trashed. Someone had dumped piles of dirt and mulch all over the grass, burying her flower beds and creating a mess so large it looked intentional. Her security cameras hadn't captured the culprit directly, but Laura had no doubt who was behind it. She spent hours cleaning up the mess, all the while seething with rage. Karen was escalating, and it was becoming clear that she wouldn't stop until she had either broken Laura's resolve or forced her out of the neighborhood entirely. The turning point came when Tom, the neighbor who had quietly supported Laura during the hearing, knocked on her door later that night. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might see him. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. Laura nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for him to sit. "What's going on?" Tom hesitated before speaking. "I don't want to get involved, but I think you should know something. Karen's been talking to some of the other neighbors, trying to get them to sign a petition to have you removed from the HOA entirely. She's claiming that you're a troublemaker, that you're making the neighborhood unsafe." Laura's jaw dropped. Removed. "Can she even do that?" Tom shrugged. "Technically, no, but if she gets enough people to back her, she could make your life even harder. And, well, some of the neighbors are afraid to say no to her. She has a way of making things difficult for people who don't agree with her." Laura sighed, her frustration mounting. "Why are you telling me this, Tom?" "Because it's wrong," he said simply. "She's been doing this for years, picking targets, harassing them until they either fall in line or leave. I've seen her do it to 3 other families. Most people are too scared to stand up to her, but I think you might actually have a chance to stop her." Laura nodded, her resolve hardening. "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate you letting me know." After he left, Laura sat in silence, staring at the pile of evidence on her table. Karen had crossed every possible line: harassment, trespassing, destruction of property, and yet she was still pushing, still trying to tighten her grip on the neighborhood. Laura knew she couldn't let Karen win. It wasn't just about the fence or the fines anymore. It was about standing up to someone who had bullied her way through life, using fear and manipulation to control everyone around her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. 2 days after Tom's warning, Laura woke to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. It was a notification from her security system. Groggy, she opened the app and froze when she saw the live feed. Karen was back on her property, but this time she wasn't alone. 2 men in dark clothing were with her, shining flashlights around Laura's backyard. One of them appeared to be dragging something what looked like a sack of gravel, while the other carried what Laura instantly recognized as a tool set. Her pulse quickened as she watched the group work. Karen pointed toward the side of the house, and the men began hammering stakes into the ground, stringing bright orange construction tape between them. It looked almost like they were marking off a new boundary line. Laura didn't wait to piece together what they were planning. She grabbed her phone and dialed the non-emergency police line, explaining the situation to the dispatcher in as much detail as she could. "They're on my property right now," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "I have security footage proving they've been trespassing multiple times. I need officers here immediately." The dispatcher assured her that a unit was on the way, and Laura stayed on the line, watching the live feed as Karen and her accomplices continued their bizarre work. One of the men finished hammering the stakes and began digging a shallow trench along the line they had marked. 15 minutes later, red and blue lights lit up the cul-de-sac. Karen froze when she heard the sirens, her head snapping toward the street. The 2 men with her exchanged panicked glances, and one of them dropped his tools, muttering something Laura couldn't hear. Laura stepped outside just as the officers arrived, her phone in hand with the security footage queued up. She pointed toward the backyard. "They're back there. They've been trespassing and damaging my property." Karen emerged from the shadows, her expression a mix of indignation and faux innocence. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her hands on her hips. One of the officers turned to her. "Ma'am, we received a call about trespassing. Are you aware that you're on someone else's property without permission?" Karen's face turned red. "This is a misunderstanding. I'm the president of the HOA, and this is official business. We're conducting a review of property lines." Laura stepped forward, her voice cutting through Karen's excuses. "That's a lie. I have proof that this isn't the first time she's been on my property without permission, and I have no idea who these men are." The officer gestured for Laura to show her phone, and she played the footage of Karen and her accomplices hammering stakes into the ground. The officer's expression hardened as he watched. "Mom," he said, turning back to Karen, "this is clearly private property. You have no legal authority to perform any kind of survey or make modifications here. You're trespassing." Karen's composure began to crack. "But the property lines are clearly marked and legally recorded," Laura interrupted. "I've already submitted evidence to the HOA and my lawyer proving that my fence and boundaries are compliant. This is harassment, plain and simple." The officers questioned the 2 men, who were quick to deny any wrongdoing. "She hired us," one of them said, nodding toward Karen. "We're just contractors doing what she told us to." Karen's face flushed a deeper shade of red, but she recovered quickly. "I was acting in the best interest of the community. If Ms. Carter refuses to cooperate, we have to take matters into our own hands." The officer shook his head. "That's not how this works. You're trespassing, and you've caused property damage. Miss Carter has every right to press charges if she chooses." Laura didn't hesitate. "I do," she said firmly. Karen's eyes widened. "This is ridiculous. You're going to regret this, Laura." But her threats fell flat. The officers escorted Karen and her contractors off the property, taking down their information and warning them not to return. As they left, Laura felt a strange mix of relief and anger. The next day, Laura met with Stephanie to finalize her case against Karen. Armed with the security footage, the police report, and the evidence of Karen's escalating harassment, Stephanie was confident they had a strong case for both civil damages and a restraining order. At the same time, word of the incident spread through the neighborhood. Several residents who had once supported Karen began to distance themselves, realizing the extent of her behavior. Tom stopped by to tell Laura that he had heard whispers of other neighbors planning to file complaints against Karen with the HOA. "She's losing her grip," Tom said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's about time." Laura nodded. "I just want this to be over." The culmination came at the next HOA meeting, where Laura and Stephanie presented their case. Karen, flanked by her dwindling number of allies, tried to dismiss the evidence as exaggerations and misunderstandings. But Stephanie's sharp arguments and the undeniable proof left the board with no choice. The HOA not only ruled in Laura's favor, but they also voted to strip Karen of her position as president. Additionally, the board agreed to pay for the damages to Laura's property using HOA funds, further cementing Karen's public humiliation. Karen left the meeting in silence, her face pale and her expression tight. For the first time since Laura had moved in, Karen had nothing to say. In the weeks following Karen's removal as HOA president, the neighborhood underwent a noticeable transformation. Without Karen's oppressive presence, the air seemed lighter, and Laura felt the tension she had been carrying for months finally begin to ease. The new interim HOA president, a mild-mannered man named Bill, visited Laura personally to apologize for the trouble Karen had caused. He assured her that the board was taking steps to reform its practices, including implementing stricter oversight to prevent future abuse of power. Bill also confirmed that the HOA would fully cover the costs of repairing Laura's fence and landscaping, and they had already approved her contractor to start the work. Despite this progress, Laura knew the ordeal wasn't completely over. Karen had gone quiet after her public humiliation, but silence didn't mean surrender. Laura remained vigilant, continuing to monitor her security system and documenting any unusual activity. However, Karen seemed to vanish from the neighborhood entirely. Her black SUV was no longer parked in her driveway, and her blinds were perpetually drawn. The rumor among the neighbors was that Karen had gone to stay with relatives in another town, unwilling to face the fallout of her actions. The repairs to Laura's property began quickly. The new fence was even sturdier than the last, with reinforced steel posts and a fresh coat of sleek black paint. Her lawn, once trampled and torn, was replanted with care, the lavender bushes restored to their original beauty. Watching the transformation gave Laura a sense of closure. Her sanctuary was finally hers again. One evening, as she sat on her porch sipping tea, Tom stopped by with a bottle of wine. "Thought you could use a proper celebration," he said with a grin. Laura laughed and invited him to sit. They toasted to the end of Karen's reign and chatted about the changes in the neighborhood. Tom shared stories of other residents who had quietly endured Karen's bullying for years, relieved that someone had finally stood up to her. "You did more than just fix a fence," Tom said. "You showed everyone that we don't have to put up with people like her. That's no small thing." Laura smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in months. For the first time since moving to the neighborhood, she felt like she truly belonged. The next morning, Laura received a letter in the mail. Her heart sank when she saw Karen's name on the return address. She opened it cautiously, half expecting another round of petty threats. Instead, the letter was short and surprisingly subdued. "I've decided to sell my house and leave the neighborhood. I suppose congratulations are in order. You've won. I hope you're satisfied, Karen." Laura folded the letter and placed it on the table. The words felt hollow, devoid of the venom that had defined every interaction with Karen. She didn't feel triumph or satisfaction, only relief that it was finally over. With Karen gone, the neighborhood settled into a peaceful rhythm. The HOA began addressing real issues rather than inventing conflicts, and the sense of community grew stronger. Laura started hosting small gatherings at her house, inviting neighbors over for drinks and conversation. It was a far cry from the hostile environment she had first encountered. One evening, as she stood in her newly restored yard, watching the sun set behind her finished fence, Laura allowed herself to finally exhale. The battle had been long and draining, but she had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever to protect what was hers. Her house was no longer just a place to live, it was a testament to her ability to stand her ground, no matter the odds.